Okay, well, thanks so much for joining this session. I believe I'm going first, and Naomi and Linda are going to go next. And apologies if you hear a toddler screaming in the background. That's my son. So I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate Lisa and Danielle including me in this double panel and double session. And it's a thrill and an honor to be with these panelists. So I'm going to talk today about to what extent the pandemic is giving us a kind of preview in the welfare state's weaknesses amid the climate crisis. So for those of you who might not know my work, I'm basically working through how my research agenda to kind of pick up the theme of the legal infrastructure of our welfare state into the 21st century, really starting with the Welfare Reform Act pro-war of 1996. And I really see myself as kind of picking up the tune that Noah Zatz and Wendy Bach and Kiara Bridges and David Super have been playing for some time. And so I've got a series of articles thinking about the SNAP program, Medicaid, TANF, and how they've changed over time, and in many ways kind of not adapted to in a way that reflects our current society. Today, I want to talk about the next paper in that part of my research agenda, which was, I was very much focused on the climate crisis, and then the pandemic happened. And so along with Ariel Giroux-Kleiman at the University of San Diego and Gabe Scheffler, who's a colleague of Lisa's at the University of Miami, we co-authored an essay entitled How the COVID-19 Pandemic Has and Should Reshape the American Safety Net in Minnesota Law Review's online companion. So my presentation is kind of based in part on the work I've done with Gabe and Ariel, and then looking forward to this next paper, thinking about how we should adapt welfare programs to the climate crisis. So I think there are three versions of the COVID-19 safety net story at a kind of high level generality that I can do in a few minutes. The first is the glass half full version. Congress passed a significant amount of aid in the beginning of the pandemic. Again, this is one version of the story. Government expenditures in 2020 increased by about 50% compared with the previous year. That's the greatest increase since 1963, when the Congressional Budget Office started even tracking this. Poverty was cut by 15%. That was the biggest one-off reduction since the federal government has been measuring poverty. When you look at the cash payments, the unemployment insurance, the food assistance, and the medical assistance, it's a significant amount of government expenditures. I commend to you Mary Bittler and Diane Schanzenbach, both economists, have an article thinking through all of these government outlays, and yet so much, there's still so much more to do. There's still such a high level of need. The food assistance and the medical assistance have gotten less play in the press and indeed in academic circles than the tax rebates, the stimulus checks and unemployment insurance. I just want to point out that 30 million children lost the access to school meals when this pandemic began. And Congress actually created a new public benefit called Pandemic EBT, basically delivering additional food assistance to these families. States could also make emergency SNAP allotments, and they blocked some of the more heinous Trump administration efforts to curtail food assistance. On medical assistance, there were also significant improvements, and there's a kind of online and telehealth story here. A lot of people started buying groceries for the first time online. People who use food stamps couldn't do that. Congress and FNS, the Food and Nutrition Service, are working to remedy that, and that could become a permanent new change to the food stamp program. The second version of the story is that the glass is half empty. Immigrants, quote unquote, childless adults, in the family law context, we might talk about them as non-custodial parents, and the already unemployed were not well suited for these safety net changes. Congress did not increase the SNAP benefit amounts. So, Catherine Powell in the earlier panel talked about her practice experience. I was a legal aid lawyer before entering academia, and in particular, I worked on the food stamp program in Chicago. 40% of the people who receive food stamps in the United States did not benefit from those initial increases that Congress passed in early 2020 because they were already receiving the maximum amount. So Congress basically increased the number of people who got the maximum food stamp amount, say $500 for a family of 3. But for people already receiving that, they didn't get another dollar of food stamp assistance. That changed with the most recent stimulus bill. So Congress did what it had done in 2009 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. They actually increased SNAP benefits by 15%, which is incidentally what Ariel and Gabe and I were saying they should do. There were also additional issues with implementation. So here in Florida, 500,000 Floridians started receiving food stamps, new food stamp recipients between March of 2020 and April 2020. The caseload went from 2.6 million to 3.1 million. Everyone was saying Florida is doing a great job with food stamps. Why? It's because Florida is used to signing people up for emergency food assistance because of all these hurricanes and storms and disasters that plague the state. On the other hand, it took Florida over 2 months to get these unemployment insurance payments out. So even in a single state, the implementation issues varied across programs. In Tennessee, Tennessee started giving out those school meal benefits that I mentioned earlier, but they only did it to families in the schools who were already receiving food stamps. But the way Congress wrote the bill is that all families in those schools that had access to free meals should get this new benefit, and Tennessee screwed it up. So they basically started delivering this benefit to only half of this new caseload. Then you've got governors and agencies and legislatures and states saying, we don't want this help. South Dakota did this with unemployment insurance. Nebraska did this with SNAP. The third version is that this is a deepening crisis and that the glass is broken. So 1 in 8 Americans reported going hungry during the previous week in December. The most recent data we have from the Census Bureau household survey, that's the highest level in the last 3 months. For families with household incomes of less than $25,000, a good kind of estimate for poor families in the United States, 32% reported having missed meals in the last week. So a lot of families are choosing between paying rent and putting food on the table. Adults are skipping meals. Kids are going to bed hungry. And then we've got Congress who dithered for 7 months and didn't pass an additional stimulus bill until December. Meanwhile, state and local governments are in free fall. So, when you look at what the Senate did and what President Trump did, it caused untold suffering for poor Americans. And the final point I'll make on this is that the reach of the crisis is wide, but the depth of the crisis is uneven. People of color, Black families, Latinx families, and then obviously Indigenous Americans are experiencing a level of deprivation that far outstrips white families in the United States. So what does this government effort tell us about future crises? A few things. I think there's more of an appetite for and less resistance to cash benefits than most anti-poverty advocates and legislators would have told you a couple years ago. And we might see this tested with the new Congress. Congress is also going to use existing programs to deliver assistance. So they're going to rely on food stamps. They're going to rely on Medicaid. They might do top-ups with unemployment insurance, but they're going to rely on the state's unemployment insurance system. That means that they're going to be heavily reliant on state governments to deliver this assistance. And that the combination of that, the second and third points, means that the government response is going to exacerbate the exclusion of Black, Latinx, immigrant, territorial, and Indigenous Americans. So Puerto Ricans, Guamanians are left out of the kind of welfare state 2.0. So when Congress tries to provide additional effort, additional assistance, we're just going to kind of continue to perpetuate this racial hierarchy within the American welfare state. The Welfare Reform Act in 1996, close to a third of the quote unquote savings in the cuts came from disenrolling immigrant families. A lot of welfare programs exclude mixed status families. They're no longer eligible. Then when we increase the assistance, we're not going to reach immigrant Americans, never mind the fact that 2 in 5 low-income American kids have at least one immigrant parent, right? So you actually can't fight child poverty in the United States without focusing on immigrant families, but we designed our welfare state to exclude those families. And then I think the last point is that we shouldn't assume the federal government can offer a sustained policy response. I think that 7-month window of inaction in the Senate is a cautionary tale. So why am I talking about this for the climate crisis? The COVID pandemic response has made me much more pessimistic about the federal government's ability to respond to the climate crisis when it comes to adapting welfare programs. If you think about the science of both crises, the geography of both crises, and the timeline of both crises, this isn't a popular thing to say right now, but I think that the COVID-19 pandemic's disruption is an order of magnitude less than the kind of disruption we're going to see in the next several years because of climate change. The science of climate change is more complicated, which makes the politics more complicated. The geography of both crises, the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting everyone. The climate crisis is going to work very differently. I mean, it's going to affect all of us, but it's going to be rolling in different parts of the country in different ways. And then the timeline, the COVID-19 pandemic will end. We might be in the beginning of the end, but the climate crisis is going to intensify. It's permanent and it's intensifying. So when you think about the forest fires in California or the destruction of in the Gulf Coast this fall, how are we going to adapt welfare programs? And that's really kind of what I want to focus on with my next paper. So I would welcome any comments in the breakout, but also in email as well. And I just want to leave you with this image from after Hurricane Maria. So I've got a paper coming out in the Michigan Law Review looking at the exclusion of the US territories from welfare programs. And Puerto Rico had to cut food assistance for 800,000 Americans who happen to live in Puerto Rico, because Congress couldn't get its act together, because Puerto Rico, unlike the 50 states in DC, Puerto Rico gets a fixed amount of money. And when there is a natural disaster or a hurricane and there's more need for food assistance, Puerto Rico doesn't get more money unless Congress does an additional appropriation. That's not true in the 50 states and DC. And so I think what the COVID-19 pandemic is teaching me about safety net programs is that we're going to have to do a lot more to fix this racial hierarchy if we actually want to have a responsive welfare state. So thanks for listening. And like I said, I really hope to get comments and criticisms over email or over Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. That's Professor Andrew Hammond from the University of Florida, Levin College of Law. And welcome to everyone who's joined us in the second segment of the extended joint program, Politics, Pandemic, and the Futures of Civil Rights and Poverty Law, co-hosted by the sections on civil rights and poverty law. My name is Danielle Pelfrey-Durier, and I am co-moderating today's joint session with Professor Elizabeth Iglesias from the University of Miami. So thank you, Andrew. Andrew is an assistant professor of law at University of Florida. He teaches and writes on admin, civil procedure, legislation, and poverty law. And he, as he did in this presentation, his scholarship focuses on how agencies, courts, and legislatures respond to poor people's claims amid structural challenges of poverty and inequality. We're going to turn now to Professors Naomi Kahn and Linda McLean, who will be speaking about the gendered complications of COVID-19 toward a feminist recovery plan. An introduction of these two could take all of the rest of our time. They are each the author of dozens of publications. Naomi Kahn is the Justice Anthony M. Kennedy Distinguished Professor of Law, the research professor in democracy and equity and director of the Family Law Center at the University of Virginia School of Law. She specializes in family law, trusts and estates, feminist Jurisprudence, Reproductive Technology, and Aging and the Law. Her latest book happens to be the 5th edition of Contemporary Family Law, co-edited with Professor McLean, who is Robert Kent Professor of Law at the Boston, and my beloved colleague at the Boston University School of Law. She is an expert in family law, gender and law, and feminist legal theory, and her most recent book is Who's the Big Learning from Conflicts Over Marriage and Civil Rights, which came out this year. I will turn it over to them to talk to us about the gendered complications of COVID-19.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I should say we have, there we go. We have slides to share, and I am now able to share them. Can everybody see them? Yes, okay, great. So as I said, thank you. I should note I'm about 10 minutes from the US Capitol, so it is good to be talking about how to improve democracy, and I was more optimistic than Andrew about the Senate this morning, although circumstances have changed. Okay, so we're focusing on gender, the pandemic, and poverty. And our basic thesis is that, as is true for all other areas of poverty law, the pandemic has exacerbated current conditions. But it also, it has also, and perhaps ironically, created the possibility for transformation. So after briefly reviewing some statistics on gender and poverty, we'll turn to the possibility of a feminist recovery plan. So our work dovetails with that of Catherine Powell, and also kind of is in agreement and in some tension with what Andrew was just saying in terms of the possibilities for change. I will say, Linda and I were going to cover certain things, and Andrew, thank you for talking about things like SNAP. So we will not talk about issues like that. In terms of some of the just sort of some of the statistics, women have higher rates of poverty. I mean, this is pre-pandemic. Women have higher rates of poverty than men across almost all races and ethnicities. As you can see, the highest rates of poverty are experienced by American Indian or Alaska Native women, Black women, and Latinas. So for example, while Black women represent 22% of women in poverty, that's almost double their percentage of all women in the US population. LGBTQ people experience higher rates of poverty than cisgender straight women and men due to the intersections of discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity or expression. So a 2019 survey by UCLA Law School's Williams Institute found that approximately 18% of straight and lesbian cisgender women lived in poverty, compared to 29.4% of bisexual, cisgender women and transgender people, compared to just 13.4% of straight cisgender men, and similarly higher poverty rates among non-conforming people as well. And here you can see the women and children constitute, and I don't mean to lump them together, but they are often lumped together. Women and children constitute 70% of the nation's poor. For parents, the female poverty rate is about 20 percentage points higher than male poverty rates, while there is a lesser gender differential when it comes to people without children. And you can see that almost 1 in 4 unmarried, non-marital mothers live with children in poverty. So So that also means about 12 million. I mean, we know the statistics. I won't go over all of the statistics. In terms of the gender wealth gap, the income and wealth gap, women are less likely to have the savings and wealth necessary to weather financial shocks like COVID-19 and provide for themselves and their families. The gender wealth gap is informed by numerous factors, including the fact that women earn less than men. They're more likely to be denied mortgages, to be overcharged for them. They're vulnerable to predatory lending. They hold more debt and face other obstacles that undermine their ability to build wealth and savings. And I was just at a presentation on the section on aging, where we were talking about millennial women of color and the high debt burden that they face. In terms of public support, we won't repeat what Andrew has already said. Obviously, there are major problems in each of these programs that have been exacerbated during the pandemic, as Andrew has already set out. I mean, there have been some promising support in some of these areas, but the inadequate funding for TANF, the work participation requirements that become particularly that are punitive to start with, and that become more punitive during the pandemic, et cetera, well known to the people in this group. Just a very brief overview on why we're focused on gender issues. There are many reasons, as I've already said, for female poverty, occupational segregation, the gender wage gap, the inadequate safety net, the minimum wage, which we all know is too low, but even at that low rate, women are much more likely than men to be paid under the minimum wage. And of course, women in low income jobs are least likely to have access to paid family and medical leave. COVID-19 has made it all worse. Of course, the poverty rate has increased for both men and women during the pandemic, but it's still higher for women. The rise has been particularly sharp for Black and Latina women, although CARES initially prevented an increase in poverty. When that expired, it's unclear how the December 2020 stimulus package will affect the poverty rate, and we will return to that at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so Naomi laid out some of these problems, and I'm going to talk briefly about some of the solutions, but I do want to thank my wonderful colleague Danielle, as also Lisa, for putting this program together. So some of these solutions are obvious, and I'm going to elaborate on some of them in subsequent slides. So these are just some that I'd like to draw your attention to. The one I won't elaborate on in subsequent slides is the VAWA law. So I'll just say that obviously intimate partner violence has an exacerbating effect on women's economic security. It leads to employment consequences. It can lead to homelessness. It can lead to health problems. So obviously, continuing to fund VAWA and making it more robust is very important. So now I'll move on to some other programs. Okay, so Naomi and I have argued for what we call, borrowing from the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, a feminist economic recovery plan that puts at the center, somewhat akin to what Catherine Powell is talking about, people who are hardest hit by COVID due to the intersecting effects of gender, race, and class. You could also think about this in the terms of a gender equitable recovery plan, which focuses on barriers that keep women in particular from re-entering the workforce and sustaining employment. So what would that look like? We should support policies for paid family and medical leave for all workers, as Naomi will advance this slide now. CARES was, yeah, okay. CARES was a modest first, 2 minutes. Okay, wow, all right, so I've got to try to hurry. So CARES is an important first step, but it was not enough. A number of states have paid leave programs. The US is an outlier in not having federal legislation on paid leave. We had a very modest attempt with CARES, but it's inadequate. So that remains a crucial issue. Okay. We also have to close the gender gap, which compound the gender pay gap, as Naomi has mentioned. These are just some of the things that are important to do because that compounds women's economic vulnerability, and the gender pay gap is worse for women, in particular ethnic and racial categories. So it still needs to be addressed, including helping women get into sectors that have more economic opportunities. It's also critical to address race and gender wealth gaps, which have many causes, as you see here, including the high cost of childcare, which I'd like to talk about next very briefly. Some of us have been writing about childcare for decades, all right? I mean, and this has been an agenda item for feminists, for women's organizations, for the Democratic Party platform at various points. Maybe we have a chance in the next 2 years to make some progress on this finally, but it's really critical to recognize the importance of accessible, affordable, high quality childcare and to improve the status and wages of childcare workers who are disproportionately women of color and low wage care workers. So there is a care crisis. The pandemic has made it worse. I'm going to skip over the next slide because Andrew has already talked about a lot of these things, but it's crucial to strengthen the social safety net in various ways. And instead, I'd like to talk just briefly about the stimulus package. It does take some steps towards some necessary things like childcare, funding for education. As Andrew said, it strengthened SNAP in some ways. It strengthened the safety net. And it also contributed to look at the last slide. We're going to do more stimulus payments. It reopened the Paycheck Protection Program. One thing importantly did is it allotted money for minority-owned business, because there's a big failing with the first plan is minority-owned businesses, and particularly there are a lot of women of color who are business owners did not get these loans for various reasons, and so it's very important. It did not extend paid sick family and medical leave, but it does provide a refundable tax credit. And so basically we're hoping that now with new Congress, there's an opportunity, at least for 2 years before the midterm elections, to make some progress on these things and finally implement these critical policies to help address poverty, in particular to help empower women and address women's poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor McLean and Khan. A rich conversation, and it makes me extra glad that we will have an opportunity to talk further in breakout sessions after the 4 presentations that we have slated for you now are over. So we'll turn now to Jessica Mantell, Professor of Law and George A. Butler Legal Research Professor at the University of Houston School of Law, as well as co-director of their Health Law and Policy Institute. Professor Mantell is an expert on Medicare and healthcare reform. Her research interests include the impact of various legislative and regulatory schemes on emerging trends in the healthcare delivery system under condition of limited healthcare resources. Before entering academia, she served as a senior attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. And she will speak to us about utilizing community-based integrated health teams to meet the needs of vulnerable populations during public health crises.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to confirm that you all can see my screen with my PowerPoint slides. I see some nodding. Okay, great. Well, as we all know, COVID-19 has just had a devastating impact on vulnerable populations, particularly from a healthcare perspective. And addressing their needs has been a priority of many public health departments, but those efforts have often been hampered by limited resources, limited data, as well as fragmentation and mistrust among the public and private sectors. But some communities have had greater success than others in meeting the needs of vulnerable populations. And they've done so by leveraging the resources of what I refer to as community integrated health teams. So community integrated health teams are teams of professionals that manage patients' healthcare related needs across different providers and systems of care. And I'm referring to both patients' medical needs, but also the so-called social determinants of health that such as food insecurity or substandard housing that adversely impact individuals' health. And these teams are made up of interprofessionals like physicians and nurses, behavioral health specialists, social workers, and community health workers. And collectively, they will focus on the well-being of the whole person. And their activities include assessing the clinical and non-clinical health needs of these individuals, coordinating care across different settings, as well as connecting individuals to various community resources that can promote their health and providing patient education and health coaching. So community health integrated health teams can improve the health of vulnerable populations when we're not in a public health crisis. But now I want to talk about how I think they have the potential to play a really significant role during a public health crisis, given their expertise, their data, their community networks, and other resources. And so I have up on the slide the 4 things that I want to talk about. It's how teams can identify high-risk individuals. Second, conduct outreach to these individuals. Third, identify and address health-related needs of vulnerable populations related to public health crisis. And fourth, can support contact tracing efforts. So starting with the first there, identifying high-risk individuals. During a public health crisis, it's very important that we target our efforts towards those that are most vulnerable to having a serious illness. So those that are likely to have serious cases of COVID. And how we can do that is we can take existing data, and community health teams often have a lot of data, and sometimes they have shared data platforms which allow them to compile data from multiple resources. Electronic health records from different providers, claims data from different payers, as well as data from social services agencies. And these teams sometimes have data analytics expertise that they then can apply and take this data and identify those individuals that are at highest risk from COVID and prioritize outreach to those individuals. And then they can reach out to these high-risk individuals. And the first goal of this outreach would be obviously to educate individuals about COVID. So educating them about preventive steps they can take, educating them about symptoms that they should watch for that might suggest that they have COVID. And I think this is especially important given all the misinformation that's out there on social media platforms, which we all know can have devastating consequences. And then second, as part of this outreach, these community teams can identify patients' relevant needs. So for example, does an individual have barriers to sheltering in place? Are they suffering some mental health issues as a result of isolation? And when we outreach to high-risk individuals, there are a lot of challenges that we face. Sometimes it can be hard to locate these individuals. Sometimes they're homeless. They may move often. They may change their phone numbers often. They also can be very mistrustful of strangers who outreach to them. They may not pick up the phone, for example, or they just may be skeptical of any guidance being given to them by public health officials. So what can community health teams do to address this? Well, they often know how to reach these patients. They may specialize in patients that are homeless, and so they know where they are, or they just generally have experience finding hard to reach patients. A lot of team members like social workers and community health workers are trained in how to effectively communicate with members of certain vulnerable populations. They have experience with health coaching in a culturally sensitive manner. They understand their population's preferences and needs, and it may make them much more effective messengers of this vital public health information. They also have experience screening for health-related needs, so they know what to look for when they outreach to these individuals and know what to ask them about. And importantly, often these community integrated health teams already have pre-existing relationships with patients from vulnerable populations. And so they've already established trust. And that means that their outreach efforts are likely to be more effective. And then the other thing that these teams can do is, once they outreach to the individuals, is identify their unique needs during a public health crisis and help to develop and implement interventions to address these needs. And that's both at the level of the individual and at the level of the population. So with respect to the individual, these community integrated health teams usually already have some existing network across different providers and social service agencies and other organizations that serve vulnerable populations. And so they're very well positioned to connect vulnerable patients to these resources. They can also help them navigate the healthcare system. So there are cases where they've helped arrange delivery of prescription drugs for those that are isolating, they've helped set up telehealth appointments, or they can help people navigate the social services sector, such as applying for unemployment benefits, or help find temporary housing for high-risk individuals who are homeless. They can also develop some individualized solutions. So one example I thought was very interesting was a team that helped someone who was self-isolating, worked with their nieces and nephews and grandkids to just schedule a time where they could deliver groceries to this high-risk family member. And then at the population level, the data and information that these teams collect about individuals' needs from their outreach can then be used to identify broader community needs. And this can then be communicated to public health agencies. In addition, these community integrated health teams can build on existing interagency partnerships that they already have to help coordinate a response to specific public health needs related to the crisis. So for example, some of these teams have worked with food banks to establish home delivery during the COVID-19 crisis. And I should note that these interagency collaborations are obviously going to be more effective when the partners already have a lot of trust with one another. And a recent blog in Health Affairs noted that there unfortunately is a lot of mistrust of the public health sector, and that has made it more difficult to have these cross-sector collaborations. But these teams, when they've already established trust with these partners that they've been working with perhaps for years, they already know how to work together effectively. And so they can more quickly develop and implement programs to address needs of vulnerable populations during a public health crisis. And then finally, they can support contact tracing. As I mentioned before, these team members often have a lot of expertise in communicating with members of vulnerable populations. That makes them well positioned to train community tracers to be more effective communicators. They can also work with community contact tracers to help train them to screen for health-related needs. I think this is something Meta will talk more about. They can help develop scripts. They can, once these individuals are identified that maybe have specific needs, the contact tracer can refer them to a community health team who can then work with individuals to address their unique needs. So why do I think it's important to talk about the ways that community health integrated health teams can help during a crisis? Well, despite their promise to address the health-related needs of vulnerable populations during normal times, let alone in the middle of a public health crisis, there's really not that many community-based teams out there. And that's particularly true of the more advanced models of these teams. And that's largely because of the lack of funding. And my hope is that there will be more funding, particularly at the federal level, to build out our public health infrastructure. And I would argue that supporting the development of more community integrated health teams should be part of those public health infrastructure plans. And that will allow us to better respond to any future public health emergencies, as well as that funding can be used just to develop these teams to help vulnerable populations when we're not in a public health crisis. So thank you, and I look forward to meeting some of you during the breakout sessions.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Professor Mantell. We'll turn now to Professor Mehda Maklouf, who's an assistant professor of law, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health Sciences at Penn State. Her research interests lie at the intersection of health law, immigrants' rights, and poverty law and policy. Recent work, The Public Charge Rule as Public Health Policy, has been cited by litigants and amici in 4 federal lawsuits. She, among her other honors, she's a 2020 Atlantic Fellow for Health Equity, and in her spare time, I'm kidding, of course, she supervises law students and direct representation of individual patients in matters involving access to health supporting public benefits as director of the Medical Legal Partnership at Penn State Law. She's going to speak with us about integrating legal needs screening and legal services with contact tracing.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end of this excellent panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss my ideas with you today, and especially to present after Jessica, because I think there's a lot of synergy between our projects. So my presentation is about integrating legal needs screening and services with contact tracing to help protect public health, build trust in the public health system, and provide tangible benefits to people during the pandemic. I'll actually be giving a slightly different and slightly longer presentation of this project tomorrow during the session on health reform at 2:45. In that session, I'll focus more on how the lack of integration of health and human services during the pandemic created problems that should inform how we think about future health reform proposals. I propose contact tracing as an ideal and immediate site to test drive future reforms that integrate health and human services in a more sustained way. In this session, I'll focus more on a specific proposal of the paper, which is integrating legal needs screening and services within contact tracing. So first, I'll briefly explain the relationship between unmet social and legal needs and disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. These disparities are a problem, even for those whose first priority isn't health equity, because if there are high rates of transmission in any community, we'll face a prolonged pandemic with many opportunities for the virus to mutate and cases to surge in the larger population. Next, I'll describe the contact tracing process, including examples of protocols that have incorporated socio-legal needs screening and services. Finally, I'll describe the basis for my proposal to integrate legal needs screening and legal services with contact tracing because of the urgency of our current situation. If it proves feasible and useful, it also could serve as a model for broader and more sustained integration of legal services in the healthcare system. By the end of my presentation, I hope to have given you a deeper understanding of how and why legal needs screening and services could and should be a part of future health reform proposals. So one silver lining of the pandemic, if you can call it that, is the growing awareness and attention to the fact that structural inequities in society are the root causes of health inequities. Been laid bare by the tragic and unnecessary disparities in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality among Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Inequities in income, housing, food, education, and access to healthcare, among other areas, create financial and legal insecurity for socioeconomically vulnerable groups. Health disparities researchers have long known that after every disaster, it is inevitably communities that were marginalized and vulnerable prior to the disaster that suffer the most from it. For example, we know that food insecurity in early childhood is related to susceptibility to certain chronic conditions in adulthood. During disasters, however, the pathways connecting poor conditions and poor health outcomes become short and direct. So poor conditions are having an outsized impact on vulnerable communities during the pandemic. Specifically, financial and legal insecurity not only increase people's risk of exposure, it also deters them from seeking testing, treatment, and now the vaccine. And it prevents them from safely isolating or quarantining when they are diagnosed or exposed. I'll briefly focus on this last point. If you think about what people actually need to quarantine or isolate in relative comfort, it's actually a lot of things. Listed here: safe and secure housing, private bedroom and bathroom, You can read those for yourself. Some people may also need the things listed on this next slide. Things like childcare, wage replacement, access to private transportation, culturally and linguistically tailored education in certain communities, etc. As a result of structural inequities, low-income households and people of color are disproportionately likely to need help with meeting those needs. Add to that the effects of discrimination in healthcare, and we begin to see why Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately suffering from severe illness and dying during this pandemic. So why focus on contact tracing as the site for integrating socio-legal needs screening and services? First, what is contact tracing? How does it work? And why is it important? Most people are by now familiar with contact tracing as the chief public health measure for containing outbreaks of emerging directly transmitted infectious disease. The typical description is test, trace, isolate, and sometimes people add support at the end as well. In the context of COVID-19, when someone tests positive or is likely to test positive, contact tracers from a public health agency reach out to them to advise them to isolate for 10 days and also to collect information about their close contacts. The purpose is to determine who else is at risk of being infected. Ideally, within 24 hours, all close contacts are reached and notified of the possible exposure. They get information about what symptoms to look for and their contacts get traced. If they're asymptomatic or test negative, they're advised to quarantine for 14 days from their last exposure. Contact tracing is especially important for COVID-19 because, unlike with other infectious diseases, it's easily transmitted by even pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic people who have been infected. When contact tracing isn't effective, the virus spreads silently, seeding new surges of cases and preventing communities from safely reopening. And recent evidence suggests that of the 3 steps in the test, trace, and isolate process, isolation is the most important. Right now, rates of community transmission are so high in some areas that contact tracing is practically pointless because those communities don't have the workforce necessary to trace at the rate that they need to. As more people receive the vaccine and rates of community transmission drop, contact tracing will become even more important as a tool to contain outbreaks. What I've found so far in my research on contact tracing protocols is that in the United States, social needs screening and support provision is inconsistent, and when it is provided, it's very limited. It seems that most communities are struggling to complete the test, trace, isolate part of contact tracing and don't have the workforce or the coordinated resources to provide support for people isolating. One challenge in doing this research, though, is that contact tracing programs are typically funded, designed, and administered on a local level, so the details of the programs aren't always easily accessible. Over the next few weeks, I hope to have found more examples of integration, but if you know of any that would be good to study and cite, please reach out. But for now, I just want to share 2. First, the Community Tracing Collaborative in Massachusetts, which is a partnership between the Commonwealth and the nonprofit Partners in Health. So this is a program that's specifically designed to ensure that people who test positive and their close contacts have the resources they need to isolate or quarantine. Early data show that between 10 to 15% of the people contacted requested assistance with meeting basic needs during that isolation or quarantine period. In terms of legal needs screening, the CTC contact tracing script doesn't explicitly do this, but a news article highlighted how experienced resource coordinators can detect and even resolve unmet legal needs after investigating social needs. In that case, a former community health worker at a federally qualified health center was able to restore a client's SNAP benefits by texting the director of the local public benefits agency. In another case, a resource coordinator was able to instigate an intervention by the CTC's attorney when a client's employer was violating her right to paid sick leave. Because PIH is advising several other states on contact tracing, they've been able to observe that other states aren't paying enough attention to the importance of providing resources for people to safely isolate or quarantine. The second program I want to highlight is a community academic partnership between UCSF and the Latino Task Force for COVID-19 in San Francisco. These services were provided through a pilot program and were actually part of a study that took place in April of last year. The services complemented services provided by the San Francisco Department of Health. In that program, community of health workers provided ongoing screening and support to participants, beginning with urgent home delivery of goods. And at the end of the isolation period, participants received an exit package, things like grocery vouchers, reusable face masks, information about community resources, etc. Because more than 90% of the participants were low-income Latinx city residents, the program emphasized culturally and linguistically tailored services. And this feature of the program was found to be very important for building trust with the participants. Overall, the pilot was a success. It was an important factor in the city's decision to create actually a new wage replacement benefit for people in isolation or quarantine. And the city has recently begun allocating funding to scale up the program. However, like the CTC in Massachusetts, there is no explicit integration of legal needs screening or services. So my proposal is to integrate legal needs screening and services into contact tracing protocols in order to provide tangible benefits to the communities that are hardest hit by COVID-19 and to protect the public at large. To answer the question of how legal needs screening and services can address the barriers to safe isolation and quarantine, we can look to the literature on medical legal partnerships. A central mission of MLPs is to use the law to address the root causes of health inequities. These include social determinants of health like poverty, education, housing, and inequality. The MLP model is flexible and has been adapted to work with different kinds of partners like local public health departments, shelters, and schools. Lawyers can help contact tracing succeed by addressing barriers to safe isolation and quarantine that are caused or exacerbated by legal issues. These include preventing evictions, securing safe housing conditions, ensuring access to safety net benefits, protecting against mistreatment by employers, providing counsel on immigration matters, and obtaining protective court orders for survivors of abuse. These actions and others can also help to build that trust in the public health system and ensure compliance with isolation and quarantine instructions. To conclude, I want to emphasize one takeaway. Although integrating socio-legal needs screening and services with contact tracing would be an improvement on the haphazard and limited services that are typically provided, it is actually a quick patch for an urgent problem that doesn't address the structural inequities that preceded the pandemic. In order to do that, there must be a more sustained integration of healthcare, public health, and human services. In tomorrow's presentation, I'll touch on some of the promising legal strategies and funding sources for doing just that. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all of our panelists in this second segment of this joint session. We appreciate you and invite you to join our participants now for breakout sessions in a separate Zoom session. For participants, we've dropped the link into the online chat, so you can join us now. And doing the same for our panelists now. Does that come through to you all, panelists? Excellent, very good. So attendees, participants, we will see you over in the separate Zoom session for breakout groups. Thanks.